Hi, my name is Sabu Francis, and I'm going to uh, give a bit of a theory about architecture and Derrida, and also introduce TAD, the design software that I created in the context of all these theories. So, let me begin. What is this and who's it for? So, this is actually a pretty theoretical presentation, but it should be pretty interesting to architects, students who have got some inclination towards theory. It would be useful for people involved in linguistics and students who have got that theoretical bent of mind to say that, okay, let's see what architecture really can be looked upon as, and want to understand differences between various isms which keeps getting discussed in colleges and all. Maybe this should be useful. Now, this presentation does talk about TAD. That's the design software which I wrote, but that's actually not really the main purpose as such. It is not to say that TAD is really justified because of all this or something like that. But TAD really came about from a different direction, from a different angle. It didn't come up with these kind of theories. And one of the reasons why I've persisted in continuing with TAD for so many years is because there are so many different ways by which the work which I did in TAD got justified or got supported, you can say. And this is one of them. So let me make it clear at the onset. It was not one of those things where somebody reads a book and say, you know what, there's some very interesting concepts there. Let me borrow some of that and then I will work out a software and then later on say, see, that person justified that. It's not like that. Though that's also pretty valid actually. It's not bad at all. In fact, a lot of standard research starts like that, right? You start reading something on a particular person's work and then you extend that work. So it's not that it is completely wrong, but sometimes it could be wrong when you have very superficially taken that particular theories and then stuck it onto your whatever else you're doing. Same is the case the other way around. Suppose, like in my case, I have developed TAD without really fully getting into what Derrida was and what he did and all that. And then later on, when I found that, you know what, Derrida is also talking about something pretty similar to this. So let me see where it fits in. So now that could be what is known as a Texas sharpshooter fallacy, where you do a post hoc explanation, HOC, POST, post hoc explanation, where after everything is done, then you say, you know what, it actually fits in with that. So even that could be wrong. Anyway, so enough said. Let me move into what really is the goal of this particular presentation. What I'm hoping to achieve is to really start a very useful debate on how we should represent architecture, we meaning the architects community, because I believe architecture needs to be represented uniformly. Now, don't misunderstand me. I'm not saying that the design has to be uniform, but the way of talking about the design has to be uniform. And it is really quite a pressing issue. We have to do it efficiently. We have to do it with the least amount of distortion, and it should be available for future generations to see what exactly did we go about doing in our work. And it should allow asynchronous collaboration. Like when you're listening to this particular video, it would be an asynchronous collaboration. If you were sitting in front of me right now, it's 4 o'clock in the morning, 4:25 in the morning, and I'm making this video, then it would have been a synchronous collaboration. You can see my body language and see my gestures and whatever. But when you listen to it later, it would be asynchronous collaboration. So you could have an asynchronous collaboration and analysis and understanding when the other person is not there. Now, this kind of goal is pretty large, and it covers a whole lot of things, and it's not going to be an easy task. I know that, and that's why I'm requesting people who are listening to this to really participate in um, all these topics which I'm raising here. So let me go to the next part. I'm using this software. It's pretty interesting. It's actually coincidentally designed by an architect. It's called Prezi, Prezi. I'm not an advocate of it. I'm not asking you to purchase it, but it's pretty interesting. And there is a kind of a tangential connection with this particular software, which you will understand as we go along. I will probably mention that. So, why Derrida? Jacques Derrida was this Frenchman, and you saw his photograph sometime back. You saw his photograph here. Okay, and Jacques Derrida was this French philosopher, but I am not very impressed by the philosophy part of what he had to say. He came up with this thing called deconstruction, and there are many people, I'm not the only one, who say that he's not really a very notable philosopher or something. He's one of those French philosophers who did useful work. I'm not trying to discount his work, but I don't think it was a very wide ranging philosophy. I would consider Jacques Derrida to be somebody who gave some really useful stuff in linguistics. And when I teach, whenever I go to college, there are some students who are talking about deconstruction and deconstructivism and postmodernism. Now lately the word postmodernism is not being bandied around much, which is good, because I think it's a very silly philosophy, and maybe this lecture is too short to tell what exactly postmodernism is, because frankly, whenever I was trying to read about postmodernism, most of the people really don't know what the heck is postmodernism, because it talks about some vague things like, there is no truth, there is no meaning, there is no concept called meaning, there is no concept called truth, there is no concept called certainty. Then what the heck are you talking about, man? Then maybe whatever you're talking is also not certain, right? To apply the same rule. So postmodernism is kind of a knee-jerk reaction, I would say. And there was this incident, that's a photograph of that, and I heard about this incident when I was in IIT, when I was in my third year, and it really was quite an ironic situation, because this is Pruitt-Igoe fiasco, it's called those days. So Pruitt-Igoe was this huge housing complex. It's probably half of New Bombay. No, it's not so big, but it could be about half of a node in New Bombay, a suburb of New Bombay, and pretty large complex. So they floated an international competition. That was the ironical part, and that competition was extremely fair. This is in St. Louis, USA. So it was a very fair competition, and very well conducted, and critics were very happy with the way it was conducted. And when they announced the award winner, they were pretty happy with the design. You should see the drawings which was made by this Japanese architect, and they had little children going around, sketches of little children going around with balloons, and mothers with prams, and all that was sketched, and that was submitted that was some of the submission for that particular competition. So it won this award, but when it was constructed, within a few years it was demolished. And it was not demolished because of any act of violence or anything. It was demolished because of the people didn't want to stay there at all. Now recently there's been a documentary which somebody made about this, and say it's not really to do with the architect. There are a lot of other factors which was at work. Nevertheless, those days it was a very horrifying event for all these hoity-toity architects who said that, wow, what a great design, and what a great fantastic design, and all that. So Charles Jenks in his book literally looks at this particular event, this specific dynamiting of that whole complex. They wanted to recover that whole space which this particular housing complex had occupied, sorry. And they said that nobody's staying there, nobody wanted to stay there. There's a lot of crime and theft and vandalism, and windows were broken, and people were getting standing in the corridor with switchblades, and ladies were getting harassed and whatnot. So nobody wanted to stay there, and so they completely demolished the whole thing to recover the space. I don't know what happened to that particular space. It's a large space which was recovered back. And this is one very important observation which I've explained in my other lectures, where we architects have to understand that we are dealing with a very raw material, and that raw material is not the built thing. It's raw material is the volume of space, because once you do something over there, it can get stuck like that sometimes for centuries also. And if you've done a bad shit over there, it'll be there for centuries. Okay, so that's why the urgency, because the world population is grown up, and lots of people, lots of development, and if you do it thoughtlessly, you may not even get a chance to dynamite this. These are blessedly expensive proposition to dynamite something. Anyway, coming back to the point. So this was a landmark event which happened somewhere in the 70s. And at that point, I think around that point was the time when in US there was this, they just come out of the Vietnam War, and a lot of disappointment about the way the country was. There was this experiments with the hippie movement and free love, and all kinds of things was going on those days, and nothing really worked. So no wonder when they said that forget it, like there's no meaning anyway. That's what postmodernism was about. During that era was when Derrida in France was talking about his idea about what people labeled it as philosophy. I don't think he was really doing a great job as a philosopher, but he had some beautiful understanding about language, and I kind of looked at it from multiple angles, and I think it makes fair amount of sense actually if you really get into it. And that's the linguistic part which I want to explain rather than the philosophy part. But it turns out that some architects kind of saw that word deconstruction. Oh wow, useful word. And this guy Derrida was pretty obtuse in his writing. He wrote this massive book called On Grammatology, which nobody can really fathom. And to understand, there's a translation. I think an Indian lady, from what I can make out from the translator's name, who translated that work from French into English, and nobody could figure out what really. It takes time to really figure out what is. It's not really a very easy text to read. And there's probably a reason for that, because in one sense, that's what Derrida is also telling, which you'll come to know. Anyway, so some architects saw this word deconstruction, say, wow, this kind of relates to the violence of this Pruitt-Igoe and the disappointment, and let's just remove all the meaning and all. I mean, all rubbish stuff started appearing. Like one of the things which happened from Derrida, I'll explain a few concepts which came up, and then I will explain what people did with that concept. Though it started as deconstruction, but when it came into architects, it became deconstructivism. That was like crazy. And a lot of people actually now are calling, calling a spade, and talking about making fun of all that. So I've linked one article over there. I've made a shortened URL, so you can pause the video and take a look at it. Anyway, so let me go to this concepts which Derrida came up with. Now, see, I'm not really trying to tell that I'm a great expert on Jacques Derrida and deconstruction and all that, but I've read a lot by now, and I have pieced together a fair amount of idea. So I'm going to simplify this. Some people will argue that I've oversimplified it, and I will agree that I've oversimplified it. If I've got something drastically wrong, then I hope you can comment on this and write to me, and hope to embarrass me. It'll be nice to know where I've gone wrong, so badly wrong that you have to flame me. But more or less, this is a kind of maybe, what, when I was teaching and all these youngsters used to talk about deconstruction and deconstructivism and Derrida and all that, and I don't like people coming up with jargon, just for the heck of it. If it is not properly explained, I get very annoyed when people are not very accurate in a serious situation. I also crack jokes and make silly puns and all that. That is fine. But when it comes to the meat of the matter, you better describe what really are you talking about. So maybe this is a response to that. Maybe I wanted to really catch hold of all those youngsters, because none of them looked at me as a guy who is really knowledgeable about deconstruction and all. I don't have a ponytail, and I don't generally flout a lot of words and all that. Though it seems there is a camp of people who think that I'm very complex. Maybe they have not met me in person, I guess. I'm not sure. Anyway, so Derrida came up with a pretty interesting set of points. And again, I'm reminding you, it's not really to do with philosophy. So I'll put it from the linguistic point of view. So one of the terms he uses is called logocentrism. I sometimes pronounce it as logocentrism. I don't know why I do that. It's logocentrism. No, logocentrism was not his invention. It was somebody, I forget his name, in the 1920s came up with this observation that when we talk about some deep thing, we kind of hold something central, some meaningful thing central to whatever that explanation which we are providing. And many times that central thing is actually outside whatever that explanation is. Like, for example, we may talk about climate, okay? And if we want to improve the climate and so on and so forth. But if you really understand that article or research paper or whatever, many times it's assumed that the main person are humans. And that's the central concept. And it's that support for the humans you're talking about climate. Which is strange, actually, because why should there be something which is holding the meaning together from a central point of view, sometimes which is external also. Like if you see somebody, I got this diagram from somewhere on Google Images. It's a kind of an ironic play on this, that to understand logo and centrism, it is referring to something outside of it, which is logocentrism is both of that kind of thing. I mean, I saw some irony in this. So Derrida was saying that, making everything well grounded around some central meaning is used to be a hidden implicit idea when you write some text. And he said, why do you need to do that? Okay, stemming from that, he pointed out some very, very nice observation. I kind of liked what he said, and he put it a lot more succinctly and very sharply. And this is something which I think everybody will understand. I have one very subtle point of view which is slightly different from what Derrida says, which I'll just tell you. So what he says is that when we are writing some material on something, we tend to gravitate towards one if there is a binary opposite. Like, for example, we have to describe, say, the human condition or something like that, and writing an article. We are writing an article about it. And we may end up, we have to be very fair to both the genders. So we'll write he stroke she and then something, or him stroke her and something. Now, when you read that, it'll be damn clumsy to keep saying he, she all the time, or him, her, him slash her, he slash she. So I think it is many times unavoidable to lean towards one of the sides. I mean, that's my personal opinion. That's not what Derrida says. Derrida is getting annoyed. He's saying that when there are binary opposites, why are we trying to get biased towards one of them? Like the Western countries are more important in our descriptions of things and articles and all that, and not so much the East. The Northern Hemisphere is more important than the Southern Hemisphere. Left-handed people are like, okay, they're not really so important. That's why it is actually what he says is true, because somewhere down the line it gets under our skin and we inadvertently maybe getting influenced by the fact. So you see the number of problems which left-handed people have, especially in countries like India. To get a left-handed scissor or a left-handed tap, they can be really they're pretty uncomfortable for them. So he says that in our communication, especially in written text, we get biased towards one of the two binaries to such an extent that we actually completely neglect one of them, and we don't realize it also. My subtle variation on what he's saying is like a little bit more gentleness about it. I say sometimes it's just unavoidable. You can't keep writing he stroke she stroke she stroke her, him stroke her. It's very clumsy to read such a text. It looks extremely formal and then becomes distracting. Anyway, so that's one very important point he said, and this has got a bearing on TAD quite a lot, my software, because I'm also very hassled with the way we when we talk about architecture, we kind of assume that architecture is what is built. Like, hello, architecture is what is also not built. Like, what did you leave behind? What all spaces you didn't occupy with built matter? That's also equally important. But in our representation, we get biased towards only whatever which is built. I'll talk more about that later. The other thing he talks about is a very, very interesting concept, which this is a neologism, okay, and I normally hate all these things, but okay, I can pardon him. He's quite an important guy. What he did, he took two words, one is differ and the other one is defer, and very cleverly mixed it up, and there's some deadly connection with some word in German and some word in French also. He's a Frenchman, and came up with this thing called difference. This, I've seen actually sometimes a few architects and all talking about difference, and I'm wondering what are they talking about. But I finally understood what they are all talking about. So it's quite easy to understand. You'll have to bear with me. What the backdrop to this particular concept is a bunch of linguists and what are they called? Semiologists, the people who talk about symbols and signs and symbols and all. Saussure is one famous one. They came up with this thing, and the whole bunch are called structuralists, and Derrida is known as post-structuralist. Now, post-structuralist doesn't mean that he's actually objecting to structuralists, but he's got some objection and some more nuances. He say, this is not the whole story, that kind of thing. So, if you read, and I suggest you should read about Saussure, it's a very interesting work which he had done. And Saussure was this amazingly brilliant professor, and he never wrote a single word. It was later on his students who transcribed his lecture notes, and that was acknowledged to be Saussure's work, and Saussure never wrote anything. And Saussure was the person who said that there is a structural system which connects all the words together. So a cat is a cat because it's not a mouse, it's not a keyboard, it's not a phone, whatever. And a phone is not that because it's not a keyboard, it's not a cat, it's not a mouse, and so on and so forth. So as you can see in this particular diagram, each one is structurally connected in some way. You have some kind of connection, and yet they are very distinct. Like one is something because it is not something anything of the other lot, so it forms into its nice little network of words interconnected. What Derrida did, he said that yes, I agree that they're all different. That's why the word differ came. So every word is different from every other word. But the story doesn't end there. He says that we don't get an absolute meaning from that one word itself. Even if that word is interconnected and all, we get a feeling that, okay, this particular word cat is different from mat and bat and keyboard, or whatever you want to talk about. But that doesn't really give you the meaning. So at this point, let me make a small digression. When my children were growing up, I used to play one game with especially my second daughter, who's pretty good at vocabulary nowadays. And so I'll say something and I will notice that she's not understood some word. So I'll say dictionary, and she will run around. All my three children will run around with various dictionaries and they will look up the meaning of that word. When they look up the meaning of that word, it'll result in one small little paragraph which is describing the meaning, of course. Then what happens? Then they've not understood some of the words in that description. So then I'll say dictionary, and again then they'll start running around searching for the meaning of the words they didn't understand to discover the meaning of the first word, and so on and so forth. It'll go like a nice little game, and then finally, like, okay, you got an idea about how it is. And this is exactly what difference is. What we do is that when we encounter a word, our brain defers the meaning. We postpone it. We say, okay, we need to know a little bit more about this. Like, for example, when I encountered people saying the word deference in some college corridor, and I did not know, so I'm going and reading about that. That is an act of tracing it. In fact, the word trace is a very important word, it seems, which Jacques Derrida was proposing. So he was actually talking about a method by which you discover the meaning, not because that word itself had the meaning, but by examining how it was defined and then getting confused by that. And it's okay to get confused, okay to get puzzled, okay to enjoy that journey of that puzzlement. That's all part of Derrida. And then go examine the meaning of those words, and then go examine the meaning of the words of those words, and so on and so forth. So you are actually tracing the route from one to the other, and maybe going to some other reference book and some text over there and getting an idea about what is this whole meaning which is written there. And that centrally is, I think, a very, very nice contribution to linguistics. Why I say that is because I'm kind of involved in artificial intelligence also. And in AI nowadays, they have, especially with text, they can process text, and they can even understand just by you give just one paragraph to that AI program, and it will tell you the sentiment of that paragraph. Does it represent is that guy angry who wrote that paragraph, or is he sad? In fact, they can even sometimes tell whether it was written by a male or a female. It's like amazing. How do they do that? Because they actually do this difference in a very metaphorical way. I don't want to get into the details of that, but they kind of, I relate that algorithm which they use in artificial intelligence to process sentiment analysis with what Jacques Derrida was telling. And it's true, right? I mean, there is nothing in a word which is so perfect that, like, just by looking at the word, you know exactly what it means. It never happens. So he's actually telling quite an obvious thing. And he coined this new word called deference, because the word is different from others, but you're not fixing on the meaning straight away. You're deferring it, and that deferring leads to a trace of finding out what does this word can really mean. it reminds me of candy floss. In Hindi we call it buddhi ka bal. And as a kid, I used to watch how that candy floss is coming. It's pretty fascinating. They put something here and something is spinning around. It's pretty hot, and magically, like, you see a fluff of that candy floss, and then it's so light. It's so lightweight, and there is no central point in that candy floss, which is what uh, Jacques Derrida was also explaining, that why should there be anything which is central to things like that? Everything could be equally importantly. And so that's a picture which comes to me, so that's why I thought I'll tell you about that. Okay, so let's go into the how it got twisted around. Now, I don't think I have more details here in this particular Prezi talk. It's pretty interesting how you can zoom in and zoom out and then explain various parts. I like to jump around, and this suits my way of talking about various different things. So there's this nice article. You just read this, okay? I've shortened the URL so you can freeze this and just copy that URL and then go and read that. So deconstructivism was like one of the, you can say, branches of postmodernism and all, and they say that they are talking about Derrida and all, and Derrida he expired, I think, 2006 or 4 or something like that. He must be really angry with these people, because he was not even claiming that there is a philosophy as such. If you read he was not particularly wanting to establish himself as a great philosopher or something, but he had some very important points in linguistics. He definitely had a point. Now, what these architects did is that they took the word deconstruction. It looks like something is getting exploded, right? I mean, deconstruction. You normally have construction, deconstruction. But they could not fully understand it, I guess, so they called it deconstructivism, whatever it is. And that was actually some kind of reaction because of that situation, social situation, economic situation. Actually, economic situation was pretty good, I guess, after the Vietnam War and all. Things were looking up. 70s, this is. So no wonder you can do all kinds of odd things with your buildings, and destroy the form and all. And some of architects, even now, they do absurdities like this, which is really sad, because on one hand they say that we are rebelling against form follows function and this and that and all. But look here, like, I mean, if I'm not mistaken, this definitely is a spiral staircase inside. Okay, though it's supposed to be deconstructivism, and this is definitely looks like a window. So they have not really destroyed that window or that staircase, whoever this architect is. I'm sorry, maybe a big architect. I'm sorry. If he's a big architect, pardon me. I will quietly nod my head and say, okay, there's something very important there. Okay, the thing is, this superficial sticking of a concept from something to the other is definitely not what Derrida was talking about a verb, a set of activity you do. When he was talking about deconstruction, it was a method to read and criticize text. It is as simple as that, actually. That if you want to make sense of whatever somebody has written, you can do a very accurate criticism by figuring out, dismantling the words, understanding the meaning, figuring out how the traces, and understanding the difference for each of those, whatever which is written over there, and then criticize that guy if he's logocentric and pointing to one central idea somewhere and say, how can you do that? Or if he's using binary opposites and leaning towards one side. These are all techniques which Derrida pretty graciously gave us for people, linguists and others who are interested in language, to criticize text. Okay, it's as simple as that. Now, text can be anything which is written, and it could be something happening in a computer also, which is where TAD and all comes in. But that's for later. But it's not a building with one static thing with everything just looking very distorted and all, and say, you know what, I am a philosopher, I am an admirer of Jacques Derrida, and that's why I made this building like this. That's all complete, utter, whatever which comes on the back from the backside of a cow or a bull or something. So that's not the way to look at it. And I think this postmodernism phase, as per many sources, also is thankfully dying out. And people are wondering now, what the hell are we going to invent? I hope they don't go around inventing something else which is equally strange or equally superficial. Where did this come from? Where did this particular deconstruction, where did Jacques Derrida himself come from? I mean, why did he think about deconstruction? And there is a little philosophy here on the reason why I think Jacques Derrida came up with. If you study his life, he was born in Algeria, a French man. He's, I think, he's a Jew in a not really in France, but in a colony of France. Okay, and he was crossing various boundaries, and I like people who cross boundaries. That's one of my pet themes in a lot of my talks. So he probably was reflecting on the state of affairs, and one of the central ways by which the Western philosophy, now here I am, getting biased towards one side and criticizing one side and not the other side. So you have to pardon me for that. Sorry. So I'm oversimplifying many things. Okay, so because otherwise it will become very boring. And one core idea which comes up again and again when people are trying to solve the problem is that, okay, let's divide and conquer it. Let's establish its structure. Like structuralism actually is a form of reductionism, according to me. That you establish the structure of what, like somebody said that, okay, this is what is a duck. This is an automatic duck. I figured out various parts of the duck, and this is how it works. Imagine like you kind of establish various different relationships inside a duck and pretend that you know the whole thing. Obviously that's not the duck, right? I mean, duck is a lot more than just this. But this is a classic reductionist way of trying to grapple with intricate and complicated things by dividing and conquer. That's the same thing which happened in the World War II. Like, two atom bombs were just released so that there's a very clean ending to the war. That was absurd, actually. I mean, it created such havoc later. And that was the reason people started getting disappointed with this whole approach. And it was not just Jacques Derrida. This was a age where Mandelbrot was talking about fractals, and they had just some other people like Feigenbaum and others. They were talking about chaos theory and weather prediction. So a lot of people were getting disappointed by taking a complex problem and, let's say, divide and conquer. Let's make a PowerPoint presentation of it. Sadly, this is actually even seen even in things like artificial intelligence. This diagram actually is a representation of what is known as a neural network, which is one of the ways by which you do machine learning, where you actually divide and conquer and keep conquering it till you teach the computer how to establish patterns. And this has started failing. There are some dramatic examples of failure of this approach in artificial intelligence. There are plenty of literature about that. And coincidentally, the guy who came up with this idea, one Canadian professor, what's his name? I forget his name. Jeff Hinton, I think. Geoffrey Hinton, if I'm not mistaken. He came up with this idea of this, and recently he said, you know what, I think let's reboot artificial intelligence. I think there is something more to all this, and it's not just this, which is pretty interesting. I started laughing when I heard that, because a lot of youngsters, they say, you know what, I want to do machine learning, I want to do machine learning. And then what you actually do is to just keep dividing and conquering and dividing and conquering. And it's not as easy as that, actually. So this is the reason why I think Derrida has still got something pretty useful to say. Derrida said, there's a very, I don't know why people make obtuse statements, but this is one of the less obtuse one. Jacques Derrida has this famous saying, there is nothing outside the text. Initially you look it looks like one of those vague statements which people make to impress their philosopher girlfriends or something like that. There is nothing outside the text. Okay. So then what happens if there's nothing outside the text? What he meant here is that let's do this exercise. Let's take a book and start reading that, and then you do that, critical linguistic analysis of it, and then you find that you don't understand the words fully. So you do this trace of the difference, and then you go around checking the meaning of each one. And then it turns out that from that book, you went to another book, and to a third book, to a dictionary and whatever. But you're always in that text only. There is nothing outside the text. What he says that if we try to put us into the text also, like there is this theory, and even Derrida really does agree on that also, that we will interpret from our personal point of view various things, right? By the way, I'm talking about all this. Why? Because I have to remember the goal. We are trying to establish how do we talk about architecture, how do we represent architecture. And architecture is not represented by written text, but it's also some form of text. That's called a representation, right? So I'll come to that. So what he says is that whatever you may do in your trying to understand some material, you will always be in text. And there's another reason why he spoke about the written material, because amongst linguists there is this bias, like I told you about that binary opposites. So one of the binary opposites which Derrida pointed out was also to do with language. So many linguists think that when you speak, that is more superior, and writing is an inferior thing about that. And Derrida immediately objected. Why? Why should writing be inferior? Huh? The writing can also influence people, right? I mean, you have situation where somebody writes one fantastic poem, and that poem itself rouses you up and changes your meaning, right? It does happen. So why do we say that what is written is a servant of what we speak? And I think it makes a lot of sense. I think it makes immense sense. In fact, there are some people who even contest. They say that language started by speaking first. But there are now some theorists and linguists and archaeologists who say that no, probably what first came was directions. Don't go into that cave. There is a bear there. Bear there. Sorry. If there's bear there, they will run to the cave. So they will put a diagram near the cave, no going there. I mean, there's no spoken word those days. They're just making symbols on some cave walls. For all writing possibly came earlier than speech, and it probably prompted our brain to put things together and start getting meaning of that. So it's pretty contentious. Though largely people think that writing came later than, and I'm not a great linguist or anything, but I don't mind considering that possibility that written material at least could exist along with speech, right? And in fact, I would say it is an act of responsibility. Whatever the linguists and philosophers may say, whatever it may be. But the thing is, when we produce something, okay, especially architects, when we produce our work, we are not just producing something for today and okay, I finished my work, let me go home. Okay, that's the end of it. Okay, it's really silly to sit down and do things like that. So when Derrida said that there is nothing outside the text, and this is what he really means, I fully agree with that. There's actually, you have to take a bitter pill or whatever the word is and swallow your own pride, and don't put in some feeling, no, that author must have felt like that to write that. I mean, how do you know, man? How do you know what that author felt? Why are you putting words in his mouth, poor fellow? The only thing which you have is the text which that author has given, right? So just, even if it is all that you have, let's not go beyond that. And that's what really happens, right? In legal terms, for example, if I write something, if I made a building and something goes wrong with the building, how much ever I'll say, no, my intention was very pure and whatever. But bloody hell, yeah, this is what you made. These are your drawings. So even legal wise, if you want to put it very banally, it has all got to do with whatever which is written over there. So when he says that there is nothing outside the text, it's got a pretty pragmatic use of it. That let's not sit down and be so pretentious that I can get into the mind of Kenzo Tange, how when he designed that building, he had these thoughts in his mind. Why we say that? Because probably we read something with some book somebody had written about Kenzo Tange. But how does he know that? He made some guess and he wrote some very impressive words. Like people like Charles Jenks and all, they write beautifully and it's very, very impressive. And you get carried away by that. And that's a disservice. Instead, you have to take a look at that text which is there and say, okay, let's not add anything more, intuitions or whatever that you keep aside. What's the responsibility of that author to leave behind enough cogent information? And I do agree with Derrida that it is not as easy as, like what the structuralists say, that, okay, we know every word and how they are related to every word. And it's that, whole structural system of words arranged together. No, it's not that. Derrida is talking about the whole process of understanding that. And that's a pretty useful thing. So let's go ahead in this whole thing, that what is the journey of an architect? Now let's talk about architecture and how all this comes together in architecture. The architectural journey of designing, it starts in 101 million ways. I do agree. Like there is no starting point. No, I mean, one architect would want to start in this fashion by massing. Somebody else will say, no, forget massing. I want to start by areas. Somebody else will say, I will listen to music and I'll start my designing. Yes, I'm not making fun of him. You can't say in which way you would start. But when you start designing, those are known as the early stages of design. It's a morass of things. It's a mess of all kinds of things which needs to be thought about. Some of those things gets discarded. Then we do what is known as design iterations. We go around cyclically into the design, and then we end up finalizing the design. And this is all one big mess. And traditionally, nobody records any of these things as such. Maybe there will be some butter sheet and things like that and some vague sketches. And then when that architect becomes famous, he'll print that out and say, wow, and we all stare at it. Actually, we have not understood anything which is there in those sketches, to be very honest. But, okay, this is so nice, no? These sketches are so nice. I don't know. They are very strange sketches according to me, very personal sketches. How is that going to help anybody trying to figure out how the hell Corbusier designed or anything? We are not trying to assess his quality. My sarcasm should not be misunderstood. I'm not trying to look at it for its, aesthetic appeal of those sketches and all. I'm looking at it from the point of view of an analysis of difference and making sure there is a meaning emerging from that, like that candy floss. If it is not, then you have to say it is not. Then you can't do anything with that particular piece of information if you cannot. And remember one thing, our future audience are not just going to be humans, right? I mean, the amount of information we have to process, the future generations have to process, is so crazy. And I don't know why it is so not... why is it so difficult for some people to understand this? We are sitting in the information era where about 80-90% of the entire history of human being, whatever knowledge pieces they created in whatever form, somewhere or the other it's got archived. Google has gone around scanning books and this and that. So everything is now available for us, and since it is available, we can't just ignore it. And now we architects, each one of us are producing buildings, but we make some vague drawings or whatever, and just leave it to be future to interpret. I mean, that is crazily irresponsible according to me. So this whole thing project, this presentation is really about Derrida, all right, but to say that we have a higher goal of doing something, it may look banal to some people. Okay, I do agree, it may look banal to some people. Now some people will say, oh, you know what are the pain points about this? We already have drawings, right? But drawings are lopsided. Drawings actually, that's why I spoke about Derrida. Derrida spoke about this binary oppositions, right? And then how we lean towards one side of the binary. And that's what you see in drawings. Drawings are lopsided. We emphasize what the built matters, what is not built. That the spaces which we decided not to put any building material into that, I mean, it's not really represented in that. Drawings are logo-centric. It requires somebody outside. There's an assumption that we are going to support humans. Why not support cats and dogs and cows and buffaloes? Why not actually? And that's true, right? Why not support wild animals and look at the piece of architecture based on how wild animals will react to it? Somebody in the future will ask us these questions. Okay. Drawings need interpretation. That's the problem, right? We cannot, like Corbusier, I wish he was around. Then he will tell, that scribble, is because I wanted to go to the loo, that's why I just scribbled that part really fast, like. And here we are trying to make deadly meaning for whatever his sketches were. But Corbusier is not there. Okay, so if you have anything which is based on interpretation, you are going to be in a big mess. That's the reason why we cannot figure out what those cave wall paintings and those directions to say where the bear or the bear was or whatever it was. We don't know, right? Many issues are considered while designing, but they are not represented. The wife of the builder or the brother-in-law's uncle or somebody will come to the builder and say, you know what, this particular thing cannot have 5 sides. The lobby of that building or whatever. It has to have at least even number of sides, something like that. And where have we represented that? Where has that architect represented? He's not represented, but he is considered that. Okay, he said, okay, TK, you're paying me, no? Okay, you're giving me the fees, no? Okay, fine, I'll make it 6-sided. Now, when we look at that particular design later on and say, wow, what a 6-sided figure, he was inspired by beehives, I'm sure, or something like that. I mean, this is crazy. So, you cannot stitch back information which was never even put over there. Then lastly, which is my pet theory, all these are my pet theory, but this one is a lot more so, is that drawings don't have any core stable alphabets. There is no ingredient at which everything finally comes to a stop. All the confusions come to a stop. When you talk about Saussure and semiotics and all, they talk about the arbitrariness of signs and symbols and all that. That's all fine. Like people can encounter a word called apple, A-P-P-L-E. Okay, and they'll say, is this meaning the iPhone company, or does it mean the fruit, or is it a reference to doctors in some tangential way? So there could be interpretation issues and controversies because of that. But none of us will have any controversy on the alphabet which is used. Nobody will have a quarrel with the letter A which is used in that apple. The letter P, the letter L, the letter E will not result in, no, I don't know why he used E over there. Should it be E? I think there is another alphabet in between E and F, which he has not used. We don't do anything like that. There is no controversy there. Because there is no controversy, finally at the end of this whole thing, now this is my observation, this is not Derrida, okay, that finally you can actually start working with these difference and all. If the letters themselves are moving around into something else, then we are in really bad shape, right? And that's the reason why old, Harappan civilization, Mohenjo-daro civilization, all those hieroglyphics and pictographs, not hieroglyphics, hieroglyphy is subtly different things. But somewhat similar to pictograms. All those things are not understandable because we don't know what they stood for, right? Because there's no real alphabets at that time. So what we really need is that all types of architectures need one underlying system of representation. Then only we'll be responsible as an architect. Interpretations you can always do. I can read a book of poetry by, say, Robert Frost or whoever, E. Cummings. Now, E. Cummings had a funny habit of never capitalizing any of his words. That was his style. Okay. Now, I'm reading E. Cummings or Robert Frost or whoever, you pick your favorite writer. You will have your personal interpretation. But one thing is certain, you have no quarrel with those alphabets which are used in that poetry, right? You can never have that quarrel. You're not going to sit down and say, I don't even know what this particular letter means. Letter is. And this, at the alphabetic level, all specializations, they have understood the seriousness of depositing information for the future, and they have stabilized that. You see this sign which I'm making here, that's an integration sign which this mathematicians use. Now you can't get another mathematician who I will not use this as I use this as integration. And if you do that as an integration, and you think it is integration, but none of the other guys will think it is integration, then you have very fundamental problems in whatever you are expressing in maths, right? Thankfully, all this doesn't happen. Okay, and whenever it has happened, it has really created confusion. Feynman, Richard Feynman, who won the Nobel Prize, he came up with the Feynman diagrams. They're not alphabets, but they're diagrams. And initially, when he came up with that, it's like a neologism, a newly invented thing. And people laughed at him and joked about it, and they didn't understand what he was talking about. But that Feynman diagrams did prove to be pretty useful, and it was his insight of how to represent something complex in quantum mechanics and physics and all that. To such an extent, now this Richard Feynman was a prankster, so he went around, he painted the side of his van. He had this beautiful van. I thought it was a Volkswagen. I don't think it was a Volkswagen. It was some other brand. And he painted that Feynman diagram on the side of that van just to taunt people. Okay, you don't understand it? Okay, forget it. I'm going to paint it and ride around the whole town. He was quite a nutcase and a prankster. So, interpretations should not break the logic of whatever which is there, right? I mean, we talk about text, somebody writes about architecture and all. A lot of our text is full of feelings. What are you going to do with feelings? Because feelings cannot be transferred. Okay, feelings are something which are very, very personal to the person having that feeling. To say that, I've seen teachers coming on stage. It is like a stage for them. It's coming on the dais or on the platform in the class, and talking about feelings he or she had about a particular project. Baba, you felt very nice about it. Very, very good for you. Okay, now if you are expecting me to get that feeling, you'll have to give me something much, much more than just trying to transfer that feeling back to me. Why I say this sometimes people don't understand this. We cannot transfer knowledge by expressing feelings about it. Feelings are always going to be there, but feelings are something which that person has to develop from within and own it. I felt something about something, some project or art or whatever, and then I go thrust it onto other people and say that you should also feel the same thing. I mean, look at the situation. Let me dramatize it. Let's say there's a child who's crying there, a teenager who's crying over there. And then you go to her and ask her, why is she crying? And then finally she explains something happened in her life or whatever. Now there are people who will say, for this you're crying. Arey, she's feeling bad. What are you sitting down and trying to tell her that she should not have that feeling, instead have some other feeling? Is that fair? Actually, very immature people will respond to that child, that adolescent like that. Okay, you'll say, okay, maybe privately you'll say, come on, yeah, I mean, why is she crying for something like this? But her life, maybe she feels really bad about that. Same way, feeling good about something is also something which that person feels, and she owns that. Architectural expression and architectural representation of buildings and all, and when I start reading about that, and if all they are talking about are the way that author felt in that particular situation, it's a very poor way of really convincing others, right? And a lot of it goes on pretty subtly also. But if there is a way by which you can represent that building over there and then stand back, and there is enough reason for others to understand that, then we can actually exercise our responsibility of being an architect. The other thing which we should have is that all specialization models, like, for energy, we have one model which we have to model that building. For acoustics, we do another model. For visualization, we use Formzy or 3D Studio Max or Lumion or something like that. And for something else, we have some other model. I mean, why? I mean, can you imagine this? That a body of work in maths or music or something, you take each part of it and you give it into a different modeling system itself. I know architecture is complex, but that doesn't mean that we should not sit down and debate on this, right? And the idea about this talk is to really sit and debate that. So the same model could be used in much unexpected ways. Architecture is full of just in time issues. As you're designing, suddenly a new parameter which you had never thought of, that lady of related to that builder insists that it has to be 6-sided figure, otherwise the project will not go ahead, right? I mean, that's completely right out of the blue, like suddenly comes and drops into your lap, and you have to consider it. So the same thing which you're talking about, the same model which you design, and even after you construct, the whole building itself is a full of serendipity providers, right? Things happen quite serendipitously in spaces. The people will come, there will be a conversation, you go somewhere, and then you will have that curio placed on your shelf somewhere, and you never realize that that's the way it will all turn out to be, right? But you still have to have that one model. Now this is quite different from, say, poetry or even mathematics or physics or anything. There probably this kind of thing may not happen, or maybe it may happen also. There are situations where they've described an experiment in physics, and then years later they realize that there's some other nuance which actually had come and corrupted that interpretation of that particular experiment, which they had not realized earlier. So there are many unexpected ways by which a model, that's a representation of something, which is used. What Derrida did is to say that, look here, meaning is not stable. Okay, what the postmodernists said, there's no meaning only. That's not what Derrida is saying. Derrida is not saying that this is no meaning at all. I mean, you can go home, it's all difference, and there's a trace of the difference, and so just go home. That's not what he's saying. He's saying that you have to analyze the whatever which the written material is, whether it is the written material is a very, in quotation mark, it could be in text, it could be a piece of mathematical treatise, okay, Ramanujan's notes, for example. It could be Galois notes. I don't know whether I pronounce his name right. Galois. He was a teenager, a hot-headed teenager, and he got into a fight with somebody, and he realized that he may be dead next day because he challenged that guy to a duel for some stupid reason. And sure enough, he did die the next day when he fought with that fellow in France. So before that, he wrote down whatever his brain was talking about on some important area in mathematics. And that particular text is still there somewhere in some museum, it seems. I don't know how much of this is true, whatever, but it's still pretty remarkable. The fact that this guy died young, but before he died, he was able to express whatever he had to say in maths. Okay, so there's a lot of things which happen with written material. And what Derrida said is, okay, let me show you how to navigate that. It's not a static thing. Okay, it's not, and it's a method of navigating and criticizing that text, whatever it is. And you should really look up how artificial intelligence is used to understand semantic analysis and various other things they do with language. So that's why all this. Now, if you really look at the way I am using this Prezi software itself, this itself is like there's no real, there's just two sentences here. But if you go deeper into it, then you say, oh, it's actually not just that. It's more than this. There is this guy here smoking a pipe. Oh, that's Derrida. Okay, but that's not what you see here. Okay, so this is what is difference, which is here I wrote just goal, but when you go in, you read the goal. And this is also kind of a fractal system, where you move in one after another, and then you get to know more and more about that, and then you find that you're actually doing self-similar steps, the kind of steps which I'm doing to do. So this Prezi is pretty interesting. It's actually Jacques Derrida at work, according to me. I'm full of Jacques Derrida today. So what are the challenges of architecture representation? One major challenge in architecture is that if you have to talk about architecture, there is this binary opposite between the built matter and the space. Now, you can't say this built matter is important and space is not, because there will be in your discussions, suppose you're designing a room, in your discussions, you would first focus on the space, and then at next moment, you'll be focusing on the wall. So the figure and the ground will keep interchanging as we discuss architecture, and this is one of the challenge of representation. This doesn't happen in many other representation system. It doesn't happen in English. You won't see the paper jumping at you, the background of the paper, and then for some minutes you're considering that, and then the foreground goes back, the letters have disappeared, now you're concentrating only on the white space. That doesn't happen. So there, what is figure and what is ground is pretty clearly understood. There is no challenge there. Okay, but in subjects like music and subjects like architecture, there is this figure ground illusion, but that's the nature of the beast. We cannot say that, no, because of that we cannot represent. Let's just represent just the built matter. It's easy. Let's get over with it. That's what we've been doing for years, and we are suffering. All of us are suffering because we have no clue how to really understand what is going on. The other problem is that there are a lot of just-in-time properties which comes in. You're designing something, and I already gave you the example of that somebody's wife coming and saying that it should be 6-sided and not 5-sided and all that. The third thing which happens is that as we flesh out our design, the nature of the representation itself changes. It becomes really heavy, like with details of all the various things. I mean, I've seen so many times students will work out the whole thing, work through the night, like the way I'm working through the night today, and they will be so exhausted, and they say, oh my god, I forgot to put the toilets, and then they say, oh my god, what do I do now? Meantime, the whole drawings are all ready and everything, and the huge amount of data, and something as fundamental as a toilets got forgotten or something like that. Okay, I'm just contriving an example. It has happened. It has happened enough number of times for me to joke about it. So that's also a representation problem, right? Because it got flooded with data, and these are all things which probably Derrida has not really got a direct answer, but still he has some very useful thing. Derrida's work can be also looked upon like fractals, This whole difference thing is like a fractal system. Now, fractals are many times looked upon as visual things. But don't look at it as visual. Think of it as a set of repetitive actions. And not exactly repetitive, it is self-similar repetitive. It is not like here there is one triangle, but here there are 3 triangles. But the kind of activities you do on that one triangle is to divide it into 3. So, but now here you have to do with 3 things, and here you have to do with 9 things. Okay, so it's not exactly the same. It's not that you're repeating the same thing again and again, but it is self-similar. Now, one curious thing about that kind of self-similarity is that it improves the efficiency of what you need to do in it's like a set of instructions which you have to give your brain, and it's a tiny little instruction, and that's good enough for you to come up with a pretty elaborate fractal here. Okay, so that's the Sierpinski triangle. I think that's what it's called. And if you look at nature, nature also really sits down and says, probably if I personify nature, say, oh, I have to make these leaves, but if I have to go handcraft each leaf separately, I have to store so much things into my brain. I don't have that big a brain. So I would rather have some similar kind of instructions which I keep using again and again. And that self similarity is not from the vision point of view, it results in self similar vision also, but more than that, it is a very efficient way of talking about the information needed to generate each part of that leaf. So that's a fractal. And now when you look back at the exercise which Derrida gave for called difference, do the trace of this, it's also a self-similar thing, right? You take one piece of word which you didn't understand, then you look up the dictionary, and then there you didn't understand some words, you again look up the dictionary. So what do you have to store in the mind? That, what, I have to keep looking at the dictionary. That's just one set of instruction. That's how fractals work. And if you look at it like that, that efficiency is what makes nature both extremely exquisite with different shapes, but yet the instruction set which went into making them are pretty simple if you really look at it. It's not like regular maths which we do, but it's another kind of math which is what Mandelbrot and others discovered. And that is where two authors, Lindenmayer and the other fellow, I pardon me, I can't pronounce his name, some vowels are missing in his name, and these two people, they wrote this beautiful book called The Algorithmic Beauty of Plants, and you can read about how they went about talking about very simply, it's almost like formulaic. It's not actually a formula, it's an algorithm actually. Algorithm and formulas are different. Formula is like one clear-cut thing. You give this to a magic box and you get an answer. But algorithm is a set of steps which you have to do. And if those steps are self-similar, quite often you will end up with a fractal. So whether it is visually fractal or not is not the important thing. The fact that you did self-similar activities and the information which you carried in your mind, this is the way I interpret fractals. So it's a much larger interpretation. Maybe the more precise term is known as iterative systems rather than fractals. Fractal is one of the types of iterative systems, but those are all semantics. So let me get into what TAD is, and then you will understand. So TAD is actually a fractal system. So just keep this image of this jelly which you can scoop, and this jelly is actually I had a GIF image which was moving around, but for some reason in Prezi it doesn't move. Okay, so think of a volume of space. Okay, so think of something fluid over there. But since we are architects, I will show it as a projection. So an envelope is a volume of space occupied by the entire room. Okay, complete volume. Now from that I will scoop out. I'll scoop out what I call as atoms. So here is an atom which has been scooped out of that envelope. And if you see this yellow which is there, okay, that is known as the leftover. So that's a built matter which is coming, but it's not fully described. Let me put in a door over there. So now when I put in the door over there, and that's where I put the door here, is known as a connector. Now you can see that if I took the envelope, from that envelope I subtracted the atoms and connector, I actually have described the built matter. Now this is a pretty interesting way to talk about built matter. Now you may say, oh, this is just one room, like how does it matter? But it is stable in any kind of architecture, anywhere. Okay, don't think that it's only for a room. So let me explain why it is a fractal. So now if I say that, okay, let me put one table inside that room. Okay, after all, this was scooped out, right? So that space is available. So this particular yellow thing is now called the leftover. Okay, pardon me, I'm colorblind. I don't know whether it's yellow. I think it is yellow. So this yellow thing is a leftover, and this particular is a table which is, like, to begin with, is called an artifact, where You say, okay, I don't know what is the constituents of that, but there's something over there. Let's assume that the whole thing is full of material. It doesn't matter. At this scale of examination, maybe it doesn't matter. So I'll call it artifact. But if you were to look into that artifact, which I will do so now, you will find that artifact itself is a collection of atoms envelopes. It doesn't, in this particular design, it doesn't have a connector. But this itself is like you have scooped out the atom inside and then you got the leftover over there, and that becomes a table over there. So if you really start understanding this process, what I'm trying to say is that all of architecture can be put by giving these instructions that, let us see where the atoms and envelopes and connectors are, and then you'll end up with the rooms over there. And then you say, oh, you know what, the table is also atoms, envelopes and connectors. Then you say, oh, there's a drawer in the table. I didn't realize that. Then you open the drawer and that drawer itself has got atoms, envelopes and connectors. And then there's a box inside that drawer, and so that itself is also atoms, envelopes and connectors. So essentially everything comes down to a set of atoms, envelopes and connectors, and this gives a pretty stable system for you to start talking about architecture. So this is the mathematical diagram about TAD, which you can pause and you can understand this, that an atom is a type of space, and connector is also a type of space, and so on and so forth. Envelope is also a type of space. You can figure this out, and this side is are the solids. It's quite easy to understand this. So now, what's the conclusion about all this? Let me go here. The conclusion is that when you are talking about, I'm just giving a little bit of advertisement about TAD. You can read that separately. But what I am talking about here really is that we all should start debating that, okay, here is Jacques Derrida, who gave us deconstruction, not deconstructivism, and he didn't really want something to be stamped as deconstruction or something like that. In fact, he was willing to sacrifice the quality of his book by really not fully, it's very difficult to go through his text, it seems. I have not gone through it because people warned me against going through it. So I read lots of other people talking about that particular text. It's supposed to be one of the most obtuse work, and it takes a fair amount of effort to read that. Hats off to that lady, Madam Spivak, I think her name is, who Anita Spivak, if I'm not mistaken. I'm not very good at names, and she has done an amazing job. If she could translate it from French into English. Recently I saw some video about somebody saying that maybe it needs to be retranslated or something like that. Anyway, so the point is that, let me summarize what I was talking about. I was talking about architecture, I was talking about Jacques Derrida's work, and I cherry picked only the parts which I think makes a lot of sense, and his contribution is about literary analysis of text, whatever that text may be. It may be English text, and I am extending to say that it could be anything which is put as a written format. Okay, you define what is the meaning of the word written, and that's what's happening in the world right now. We are no longer even drawing, we are putting things on a computer. So even computer data could be analyzed using Jacques Derrida's techniques, and which is what, in a very tangential way, I have not seen any paper directly talking about post-structuralists and artificial intelligence. I'm sure somebody must be talking about it somewhere, because I see a fair amount of similarity. And the way he says that you have to talk about difference, and he was talking about being neutral and not bias one thing over the other. But I feel that sometimes is a fait accompli. You can't go around saying his/her/his/her and all. So that's my take on it. It's not Jacques Derrida's position, but I do agree that everything needs to be placed neutrally in front of us with no logocentrism. There should not be anything which is outside the text dictating what the structure of that particular thing should be. If we do like that, as architects are actually at the forefront of knowledge creation. At the forefront of knowledge creation, because whatever an architect does, it is a new piece of knowledge, whether we like it or not. Okay, we just cannot copy. Even if you want to copy it, you will not end up with the same design again, because the plot itself is different. Okay, the people using the plot would be different. So by that sheer fact, you are going to be doing something brand new, and when something brand new comes, very unemotionally, it's a new piece of knowledge. And if it's a new piece of knowledge, you better be responsible to ensure that the future generations can pore over it and make sense of whatever is there, like that candy floss emerging. Okay, instead of giving very rigid rules that this is exactly what I meant or that is exactly what I meant. No, that I think the post-structuralists have done a pretty good job of convincing, at least he convinced me that okay, structuralism, and then they, mind you, they're all building on top of each other. They're not fully contradicting anything. Okay, it just there was this deviation into deconstructivism and postmodernism for no rhyme or reason, which is it speaks very poorly about the intellectual inquiry which we architects do. So there you have it. This is the entire discussions about architecture, Derrida, and a little bit about what TAD is. And I hope this debate will go on, and I hope you have enjoyed this talk. Thank you so much.